Hello, this is Angelia, and you are listening to or watching the podcast Why You Do What You Do. It's about human development psychology, trying to help you figure out maybe a little bit more why you do what you do. And last time we were talking about how theory and research work together. So we're going to pick back up on that. With this vital connection between theory and research in mind, let's look at the methods developmental researchers use. And those are the researchers that, are studying human development, how we grow and develop as a person. Research methods. Excuse me. I just took a drink, but two key issues at the outset of a scientific investigation are how the participants will be chosen and how the data will be collected. So they decide, who do we want for this study, and how are we going to gather the data that we're going to study? These decisions often depend on what questions the researcher wants to answer. So, if you're figuring out how does the kid learn, not to steal, they might set up a situation where they could take some candy. I saw a study done on that online. There might be a punishment or, a perceived punishment. So they're going to study how these children react and act in a given situation. Or it might, be as simple as wanting to see how parents interact with the child when they don't think anybody else is around, It just, depended on what study they had, what they wanted to know. All these issues play a part in a research design or plan. And yes, research, has to have a plan like everything else. They design a plan and then they follow it out, just like, build a house or starting a business or whatever. There needs to be a plan. Researchers in human development work within two methodological traditions, quantitative and qualitative. And we've talked about that before. Quantitative research deals with hard objectivity, measurable data. For example, how much fear or anxiety patients feel before surgery, as measured by standardized tests, psychological or physiological changes, or statistical analysis. So they would look at all these things to decide, how much anxiety a patient is having before their surgery. And of course, we're all going to have some. Surgery is, not something that we just usually take lightly. Behaviorists generally use quantitative research. Qualitative research deals with soft data about the nature or quality of participants' subjective experiences, feelings, or beliefs. For instance, how patients describe their emotions before surgery. Or, as with Margaret Mead's research, how girls in the South Sea Islands describe their experience of puberty. The qualitative has to do with the quality, how the thing is, not how much. That's quantitative. And so we're looking at, a quality of some sort. Piaget's clinical method is another example of qualitative research. Quantitative research is based on the scientific method as overall process that generally characterize scientific inquiry in any field. This, I'm sure, from science classes, especially if you went to high school or in college. Scientific method is, which tout, you got to come up with your theory and use the scientific method to, try and prove your theory. So careful use of the scientific method enables researchers to come to sound conclusions about human development. So it's actually a science now. We've gone past, where it was philosophy, with Freud and, the Erikson, the early eyes, where it was a philosophy. We think this is a thing. Now, you can use the scientific method on human development psychology. It's a science. So the old-fashioned views of some people who believe they don't know what they're talking about, these head shrinkers, Well, you're wrong. Maybe back in the day, in Freud's day, yeah, they come up with some theories that, were proved not to be sound. But now, like I said, the scientific method is used, and, these things are science, hard science proven. So, there is pop psychology out there that, people do things for fun or whatever, and you see the little tests in magazines or whatever. That's not real psychology. And there's real hypnotherapists out there. They're not going to hypnotize you and make you quack like a duck or whatever. They're going to help you explore things, in your past or things you're repressing. So don't let the pop psychology and the, old-fashioned belief system fool you about human development psychology. It's a real science nowadays. The usual steps in the method are, in case you forgot, identifying a problem to be studied, often on the basis of a theory or of previous research. Like I said, these guys, they built on each other's theories and previous research to come up with their own hypotheses. Formulating hypotheses to be tested by research. So in order to test anything, you have to have a hypothesis. Collecting data, and of course that's how the studies come in. You do these studies, you collect the data. Analyzing the data to determine whether or not they support the hypotheses. And if you've ever done a science project where you had to use the scientific method, sometimes you found out your hypothesis is not true, and sometimes it is, So it's a good thing that there is a scientific method, because then you can test, your science and see whether there's validation there. Disseminating findings so that other observers can check, learn from, analyze, repeat, and build on the results, because that's the goal. There are some scientists who don't want other people to check out their stuff, but for the most part, for the advancement of science and healthcare, you want to look at what other people have done and be able to build on that, because everyone has different ideas. So if we have one guy who came up with all the ideas, we'd only have one way of, healthcare. And then people come later on wouldn't be able to, build on that and find more discoveries to help people. Qualitative research takes a more open-ended, exploratory route. Instead of generating hypotheses from previous research, qualitative researchers gather data and then examine it to see what hypotheses or theories may emerge. So it's kind of backwards of that. But, in doing that, they're looking at the qualities. What stands out here, and then they can disseminate that and work back from that and figure out where that fits into, certain hypotheses. Like, oh, well, we saw this, and this guy suggested this, and this kind of supports that. So, in either case, whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative research, it can help support hypotheses from people who've come before, or a new one that you've come up with. Qualitative research is highly interpretive. It cannot yield general conclusions, but it can be a rich source of insights into individuals' attitudes and behavior, because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that goes along. Describe your symptoms. Describe how you feel about this, that, or the other thing. And, that is a very personal thing, because everybody's different. So everybody's going to have, different answers. There might be a average, but there's going to be some who fall to the left or the right of that. And so, it's not, a hard fact. It's the opinions and, things that people feel. The selection of quantitative or qualitative methods depends on a number of factors. The topic for study, how much is already known about it, the researcher's expertise and theoretical orientation, and the setting. So they, decide these things. What are we going to study? Where are we going to do it? What way are we going to do it? And that's important to figure out what they want to know. And that's important, for you in any new venture that you're going to take in your life, you need to have this. You can go about it your own way in a scientific method, and decide, what, how, what all is going to be involved, who all is going to be involved, and this is a way that you can do things like this in your own life. Quantitative research is often done in laboratory settings, where controlled conditions can produce replicable or repeatable results, because that's what you want. That's how it stands the test of whether this is a fact or maybe not. Is if you can get several researchers to duplicate and have the same results, then chances are that's a fact across the board. Now, like I said, everybody's different, so there's always going to be, falling to one side or another, but in general, on average, this is a fact if your results can be replicated. Qualitative research is most appropriate in everyday social settings for investigating topics about which little is currently known. And that's, what everybody really wants to have a big breakthrough. It's about, we're going into this new area and we're going to figure this out. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. Excuse me. Qualitative research can, let me see, I lost my place, can be extremely time consuming and expensive. And that's why usually they go to universities to get grants, they apply to the government to get grants to do these big studies about things, because it would be kind of expensive for them to have to rent out a space or buy a space and then have all these people coming in and maybe pay them to participate, or something like that. So usually when they do this type of research, it's usually in a university setting. Investigators may combine the two methods, and you can do both. You can have quantitative and qualitative questions and observations, and the more you can find out, the better it's going to be for your hypothesis. If you can prove this, that, or the other thing, or if you get enough input into a certain way or another, to say on average people feel this way, or this is what happened. Often qualitative research yields findings that point the way to quantitative research, and that's for the simple fact that the way people feel about things can show you how a thing probably is, and also show you excuse me, again, the average, which you can build on. You can look back at other people's researches, and you can build on that and say, aha, well, maybe this is a thing. For example, patients' descriptions of their experience may suggest means of reducing stress before surgery, which can then be tested and compared for effectiveness. Excuse me. So, they can get an opinion, and they can get an average, and then they can decide, okay, so this is a thing that we need to do something about, and then make a plan on how to do something about that. Sampling. In qualitative research, samples tend to be small and need not be random, so they can decide who they want in their study. Participants in this kind of research may be chosen for their ability to communicate the nature of their experience, say what it feels like to go through surgery, or because they have undergone a particular type of surgery. So, if they were studying how you felt about, say, breast cancer surgery, they would pick out people who have had that, and then they would want to know what your experience was, and they can form an average and decide, if this is a thing and what can we do to help patients to overcome this thing or lessen their anxiety before a surgery. Sampling is a more complex issue for quantitative research, because you're dealing with facts, and in general, quantitative doesn't lend itself so much. Excuse me here. I'm going to have to get this plug in. We had some issues earlier with some updating. So it's eating more of my battery than it normally does. So I'll have to hook it up to its tether. Yeah. You're good. To be sure that the results of their research are true generally and not just for oh my goodness, for specific participants, quantitative researchers need to control who gets into the study. And that's, so that they're only getting the people they want. Because, if you have someone who's had gallbladder surgery and the breast cancer study surgery, that's not the same, that's apples and oranges, right? Because studying an entire population, a group to whom the findings may apply, is usually too costly and time-consuming. Investigators select a sample, a smaller group within the population. Like I said, that was the example I gave, was the breast cancer surgery. The sample should adequately represent the target population. That is, it should show relevant characteristics in the same proportions as in the entire population. And that depends on what the study is going to have to do with. Otherwise, the results cannot properly be generalized or applied to the population as a whole. And again, that's if you're wanting to do a study that would apply to the population as a whole. To judge how generalizable the findings are likely to be, we need to compare the characteristics of the people in the sample with the population as a whole. And again, it depends on what your study is about. Often researchers seek to achieve representativeness through random selection, in which each person in a population has an equal and independent chance of being chosen. And again, that depends on what your study is about. If we wanted to study the effects of an educational program, one way to select a random sample would be to put all the names of participating children into a large bowl, stir it, and then draw out a certain number of names. I actually, when I taught adult ed through our school system, I had a couple people who had some problems with my starting over for women class. There were people who cried in this class when we were talking about relationships and things. And so they were clearly not ready yet to start over. They were still dealing with, the trauma from the past relationship. And there were people who dropped out. And so as I was curious as this was a problem and maybe this is something we could talk about later on, I contacted a few students and I said, hey, when you came to this class, did you think it was about this or whatever? A lot of people thought it was about, investing. And that surprised me because, the class was named Starting Over for Women. And I thought that was pretty clear, meaning women who are starting over, from something. But a lot of them thought it had to do with retirement income. And so I was a little confused on that. So, when we wrote the description in the, course book for the next fall, I made sure and spelled out, things, because I was like, I didn't think that was confusing. I didn't think that anybody would think that's what that was, but there were a couple of women who did. So, because I did that, I learned that there were people who thought that, and then that's why they dropped out of the class, because they thought it was about retirement income, and that's what they had expected. So their, expectations were incorrect, and that's what they were really interested in. And then other women were just, not ready. They said, I'm not ready to deal with this. I'm not ready to talk about this yet. Maybe I'll take the class again later. To find out how the September 11th terrorist attacks affected the mental health of Manhattan residents, researchers reached 1,008 households by random digit dialing and conducted telephone interviews with the adult in the household whose birthday was most recent. And, you know, that's just a study they wanted to do. I'm not saying I approve of that study, but that's just a study someone wanted to do. In the interviews, which were conducted within 2 months after the attacks, 9.7% of the sample reported current symptoms of depression, and 7.5% appeared to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And of course, that only makes sense. And again, that's why I said I would not be a fan of that. That's like these reporters who go to these disasters and ask these people who are already almost in tears, how do you feel about, how you lost everything? Of course, I call them tear jerkers because they're being jerks, in my opinion, to try and get this person to cry on camera, for ratings. I think that's terrible myself. Among adults living near the World Trade Center, 20% reported symptoms of PTSD. And again, that's not surprising. You witness this thing, you hear the noise, you might feel the vibrations, and it's so close to home. That movie that they made about that, I forget what it's called, like something incredibly close, incredibly loud, or something like that. But I mean, of course, that only makes sense. The researchers then generalized the findings to estimate that the extent of those disorders among the population of Manhattan, and of course, that's going to be most of the people, right? Because it was so close to where they are. So, I don't know. Somebody did it. That's on them. Unfortunately, a random sample of large population is often difficult to obtain. And that's true because a lot of people, they're not going to want to take. I used to get survey calls and I'm like, no, I'm not interested. I don't have time for that, because sometimes I wouldn't. They didn't want to take no for an answer. Well, just a minute. He's like, no, I'm walking out the door. Bye. So yeah, I can imagine it is. Instead, many studies use samples selected for convenience or accessibility. For example, children born in a particular hospital or patients in a nursing home. The findings of each study may not apply to the population as a whole because, the people in Manhattan were certainly more affected by 9/11 than those of us who are, halfway across the country. Because that was like right in their backyard. It was happening. They could, see it. It was close. They could probably smell the smoke, feel the vibrations, and, to them, it was probably a lot more than it is to us. Geez. Forms of data collection. Common ways of gathering data include self-reports, verbal reports by study participants, tests and other behavioral measures, and observation. And there's lots of different ways you can gather data. Researchers may use one or more of these data collection techniques in any research design. Qualitative research tends to depend heavily on interviews and on observation in a natural setting, whereas quantitative research makes use of more structured methods. And again, that's because the qualitative has to do with talking, finding out, the quality of a thing, whereas the quantitative is measuring something. A current trend is toward increased use of self-reports and observation in combination with more objective measures. And that's why, like your doctor's office and them, they send you that questionnaire, and these other businesses will send you a questionnaire after you've been there. They want to get your input. They want to see what the average is on how we're doing, what's our problems, what we're doing good. Excuse me. Self-reports, diaries, interviews, and questionnaires. The simplest form of self-report is a diary or log. And I don't know, some of you might have participated in like a medical test or whatever, and you're supposed to keep a log or a diary of what you're doing. Adolescents may be asked, for example, to record what they eat each day or the times when they feel depressed. And, sometimes they do that in health class. What'd you eat? Or if, you're being treated for depression, they might want to know what makes you the most depressed. When are you the most depressed? And they can, help you find a medication or help you use techniques to help you to overcome in those, points of times, where, things that'll trigger you. In studying young children, parental self-reports, diaries, journals, interviews, or questionnaires are commonly used, often together with other methods such as videotaping or recording. And a lot of these, happen in counselor type settings, or school type settings. And, they'll videotape it. I'm sure we've all seen the, movies and things where, there's a two-way glass and they're videotaping interactions and things. In a face-to-face or telephone interview, researchers ask questions about attitudes, opinions, or behavior. And again, like I said, a lot of people don't want to take those, so, it's good luck to the guys doing it that way, because, you don't know who you're going to get, and usually the people who will sit there and listen to you longer are older people who are kind of lonely anyway, and, they're happy to help out, so... In a structured interview, such as one used in the study of reactions to September 11, described in the preceding sampling section, each participant is asked the same set of questions. An open-ended interview, more often used in qualitative research, is more flexible. The interviewer can vary the topics and order of questions and can ask follow-up questions based on the responses because, they want to know more about certain things that maybe pop up. To reach more people and protect their privacy, researchers sometimes distribute a printed questionnaire which participants fill out and return. And that's so a lot of places will send you those, the questionnaire, fill this out and return it. Because they're trying to figure out, what they did good, what they did bad, and what's going to, help them out. By questioning a large number of people, investigators get a broad picture, at least of what the respondents say they believe or do or did, because, people aren't always honest. They might decide to give you a break, or they might be having a bad day and decide they're going to rake you over the coals in a questionnaire. So, however, people willing to participate in interviews or fill out questionnaires tend to be unrepresentative of the population as a whole, because like I said, a lot of us, we don't want to deal with that. We're busy, we're doing things, we don't have 20 minutes to sit there and answer your questions. We just don't. Furthermore, heavy reliance on self-reports may be unwise, since people may not have thought about what they feel and think, or honestly may not know. So they said, it sounds good to me, my husband's one of those people, just fill out the circles, I'm not worried about it. Some people forget when and how events actually took place, and others, consciously or unconsciously, distort their replies to fit what is considered socially desirable. Because a lot of us, that's what we want. We want to fit in, and we want to do what we think is socially desirable in this case. How a question is asked and by whom can affect the answer. When researchers of the National Institute of Drug Abuse reworded a question about alcohol use to indicate that a drink meant more than a few sips, the percentage of teenagers who reported drinking alcohol dropped significantly. And that was reported by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. When questioned about risky or socially disapproved behavior, such as sexual habits and drug use, respondents may be more candid in responding to a computerized survey than to a paper and pencil one. And I had a doctor that I went to for a little while, about 5 months, who thought sexually active meant you were having sex with a whole bunch of different people. Because she asked me, was I sexually active? I'm like, well, I'm married, so. And she goes, oh, well, we need to get you some STD testing and blah, blah. was like, wait, what? I've been with the same person, for like 8 years now. And she's like, oh, well, you said you were sexually active. I said, well, yeah. And she's like, well, that means you're having sex with a bunch of different people. I was like, no, it doesn't mean that. So I taught her something, and I'm like, I don't know about people. Behavioral and performance measures. In quantitative research, investigators often use more objective measures instead of, or in addition to, self-reports. Because like we just said, self-reports might not be, the most honest way to get answers to your questions. And that's where we're going to stop for today. I hope that helped you figure out a little bit more about why you do what you do. Until next time.